events of the past 18 months have changed the world forever. What started out as a frightening and inconvenient health crisis turned out to be much more devastating, virulent, and pervasive. In early spring a year ago, we were all looking for some sort of return to normalcy in relatively short order. How we did business was compromised, but surely we'd be able to return to living and working just as we had before the pandemic. Sitting here today as we enter summer 2021, what we can see is that the sheer volume and intensity of the changes we've encountered and endured is far beyond what most of us ever anticipated. Point. Almost every interaction we have now starts or ends with the digital component. Point. The liberty we had for unrestricted travel will never be the same. Point. Working from home under COVID rules is rapidly becoming a shift to remote working, a model that we probably should have been on top of a decade ago. In that last point, the future of work, let's look at some indicators as just to how pervasive these changes are. Over the past year, the sheer mobility of the workforce has grown at an exponential rate. Pandemic working is blending now into a future of remote working, and remote working is leading to unprecedented talent mobility. Talent is being recruited regardless of location. For many organizations on the hunt for top talent, it is totally acceptable to live in Colorado and work in Connecticut, or vice versa. Competition for talented and skilled people has never been higher. In 10 years, the Gen Z cohort will be firmly ensconced in the workforce. They are the echo generation of the late boomers, and there are 68 million of them right now in America alone. And let me assure you, as any parent of a 20-year-old will, yes, they think differently. My guest today is Pranam Lapinski. He's the founder of Door of Clubs, a Gen Z-focused talent organization that lets university recruiters connect with a diverse base of talent. He's a land development entrepreneur and a tourism development aficionado. And he's the author of the insightful book, Working with Gen Z. Good morning, Pranam. How are you? Where are you?
Good morning, David. I'm glad to be here. I am in beautiful Western Massachusetts in the Berkshires, which some may be familiar with.
What's it like there on the ground today in terms of the pandemic?
Well, it's starting to open up. We are in a good place in terms of our state and the amount of vaccinations. I just saw a bunch of my friends yesterday, actually, unfortunately at a wake, but it allowed everybody to get together that was double vaccinated that, wasn't possible a few months ago.
Wow. Well, thanks for that, and I'm sorry for your loss. So let's talk about. I want to talk to you about Gen Z because you're just so eloquent in that area. But it's a harbinger of so many things that we face in this industry, the tourism industry, and every other industry. It's one of many things that we have changed forever, as we talked about in the opening. But I want to talk for a minute. Rather than diving into who is Gen Z, I want to understand, why did you make this your life's work to date? I mean, you're a successful entrepreneur. You have a very young, successful development company for rural properties. You went to university thinking you might be a doctor. You were the co-captain of the soccer team in university. How did you end up on this path?
It's a great question, because for me, it's just been an accident to get into understanding this next generation. I think it really starts and ends with this passion for building empathy. Whether I was in a sports team or I was in any organization at college or high school, it was always, there's always going to be the misfits or the ones who are different. And I grew up very different in my small town of the Berkshires. I was the only kid in town with a mother from a different country, and the only kid in town with a different name, and one of only a few kids with a different shade. And so I think I just saw that, when you're different, empathy can be a great thing, because, there's a lot in common with people. So as I journeyed from rural land development and then wanted to work in tech and with students, started this company called Door of Clubs that you mentioned. And what we did was we helped college student organizations. So think about your tech club or your business club at your local university or college, and these are a bunch of kids that get together on a Wednesday night instead of going out to the bars, and they're talking about tech. They're jamming about business. And I really felt like there needs to be some visibility or some efficiency to connect with them. And so we focused on building an online platform and a database that allowed employers who want to get to these students who are so passionate and skilled in their interests, and employers really want to hire those types of students. So we made an online platform for that, and that gave me this front row seat between employers and college students. And I was in the trenches, seeing how they're interacting with each other. And a lot of employers were still using a millennial playbook on Gen Z, and I started to realize, just looking at the data, how different the generation was, Gen Z from millennials. So we did some studies, have surveyed over 10,000 students, and I just became more and more fascinated, realizing how different they are from millennials, and for some critical reasons.
So you start door clubs to address an issue that you see as needs some attention. And this is early on in the sort of, we're most of us are still obsessed with millennials as they make up the bulk of the workforce, and you're looking at Gen Z. At what point did you realize that this was big? I mean, you've been a guest now on so many shows and so many things. You unlocked a little piece of intelligence that we all maybe didn't know we needed, and it's become very, very mainstream now. You have been busy, haven't you?
Yes, and it's just started. That's the interesting thing. Gen Z, as you mentioned, over the next decade, their growth is going to be exponential. So we're starting to see it become mainstream. And I was starting to dig into this a few years ago and starting to, talk about Gen Z. Now we see it becoming more mainstream, but really they're going to grow in terms of their size in the workforce. It's going to 3-4x over the next 5-10 years, where right now we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. So it's been a big topic of discussion now, but it's really just beginning. And I care about building that generational empathy, because while they are different, there's a lot of good things that employers and from a consumer standpoint too, where Gen Z can bring a great amount of value to the world and to employment, and to anybody that's even selling anything or selling a destination or travel or whatever. It's a really important cohort for the future.
So a number of years ago, more than a decade, a Canadian academic, David K. Foote at the University of Toronto, wrote a prescient book called Boom, Bust, and Echo. And when I try to understand Gen Z, it actually seems confounding till I remember that Gen Z is that bulging cohort that's so big, because those of us that were exactly at the end of the baby boom and Gen X, which is you're born 63, 64, 65, that's one of the biggest cohorts in the history of the boomers, the very closing end of that epoch. We're the parents of those Gen Zs, aren't we?
Yes. That's, you think about the parent-child relationship, the Gen X boomer, on that line, that is the parents, and Gen Z is the product of that.
So then it becomes a lot less confounding, because I think of all the qualities and values we tried to instill in our families and our offspring, and what we're hearing back is the amplification of a lot of those things: equity and diversity, tolerance, aspirations, hard work, self-reliance. Why does it seem so surprising when we hear that back? Why are we shocked by that?
I don't have the sociological answer, but I think from a high level, I do think that with this technological revolution that's happened since Gen Z was born, and what I go by is 95 being the year that Gen Z began, 95 to 2012. So their age is 9 to 26 or so right now. but yeah, that we see now in a very transparent light, like we've never seen before, and hyper connected. I think technologically, it can be very unsettling for us. We can lose our our broader view understanding of things because we're so caught into the hyper connected day to day of it. But I think you're right. You can draw that line or that thread between Gen Z and the early '60s, mid '60s, '70s.
So, I mean, we're already touching on it. You know, what are their values? What motivates them? What does their daily life look like? Let's talk a little bit about the book, Working with Gen Z, because there's some great insights in there. Could you give us, you know, you've had to do this 50 times over the last year. Can you give us the book tour talk on the importance of the book and the values and what motivates them?
Yeah, well, we've really taken this broad view and broken it down just into three keys. And let's think of this generation as, you know, we're on the outside looking in, and we will be locked out if we don't have the right keys. And one is to get into one door, the next is to get in the next, and the next is to get into the final door so that we can be connected with them. And those three keys that we need is just a simple acronym called ISA. And you can remember it as ISA. And the first stands for inclusion. Inclusion is, you know, their hallmark cause more than any other cause, and it's the number one way that you can build trust. If you lack any sort of inclusive or equality minded practices as an employer or as an organization, Gen Z will not trust you. And you and I know, David, and your listeners, that with any new group or new person, the biggest gap we have to bridge is trust. And so that first key, which is so important, is inclusion. And we see that now from all of the happenings over the last few years. And this is really tied to growing up with President Obama as their, you know, leader, and seeing that as a non-negotiable, and then also the undercurrent of the demographic changes. You know, it's the first generation that's bordering on, you know, minority majority, and it's only accelerating in terms of, you know, non-white becoming a bigger part of the U.S., the world.
Sure.
So these things really, really matter to Gen Z.
Okay, so that's inclusion. What's the S?
The S is stability, and stability is again this hyper-connected, hyper-polarized world. And Gen Z grew up during the Great Recession. They saw their parents have to put off retirement, vacations. So they know what the financial panic looks like. Now they know what, you know, a pandemic looks like. They saw school shootings as a normal part of their lives, that they had to go through all these drills growing up and as children. And then they, of course, spend so much time on their technology. Since the fourth grade, they have a smartphone. There's so much instability in their world, in their lives, that, you know, if you can provide financial stability, you'll see this generation being very, very frugal and smart. They will also want to work for larger organizations instead of, you know, starting their own businesses always, like millennials wanted to do. And the emotional and mental health and wellness aspect is so critical.
Can I interject with a question here? And this is not at all a negative question. It's an observation and a way we deal with the world. They're sometimes touted as being perhaps the most anxious generation we've ever had. And for a late boomer, early X who created a life that was very, very comfortable compared to our immigrant life coming to Canada, it confounds me at sometimes their anxiety. But when you just list off the financial crisis, the school shootings comment made my hair stand up. And I think of what poured into their eyes through the living room. And we used to sit back and talk about the trauma of seeing Vietnam come through the news in 1970, 71. It's funny till you said it, I just feel ignorant, but I hadn't thought about Columbine and the events that just unfolded as de facto when they were in their most formative years.
Yeah, it's a keen observation that you picked up on, because according to the American Psychological Association, this generation has the worst mental health of any generation. They're the most stressed out. Number one stressor, school shootings.
Wow. Wow. So, I mean, and school shootings a classic um, incident that doesn't create just PTSD of the people who are there, but PTSD stemming from the idea that you can't control your environment, and that at any point in time it can reach out and slap you. I just had not thought of it till today until you said that. It explains a lot. All right. A is not for anxiety, though. What is A for?
A is for authenticity. And, of course, that's a buzzword everywhere. But this generation sees 5 times the amount of ads that millennials did growing up. They're now seeing 4,000 ads a day. And they're used to that in terms of the smartphone having access to their minds, their brains, this bombardment of commercial attempts at their attention. So anything that feels inauthentic, they're going to sniff it out really, really, really well. If it's not personalized, if it's not kind of hand-baked, they're going to stay away from it. It's like, think about, the older you get in generations, the more you believe online, whether it's my grandparents or my parents, they're going to be easier targets for phishing online or, advertisements that say something and they might believe, whereas the younger generation, they're going to stay 10 miles away from that thing.
So let me ask you this question then. In a literally a global political dialogue that has been polarized to the left and the right, I mean, all of us live in the middle in our societies, pretty much wherever we live. But the narrative around the politics of our societies has taken a frightening turn to very polar left, very polar right. As my Gen Z grew up, I worried about her ability to discern, the middle path. And really, years later, I can say to you, she looks at me and says, "Dad, I get it. I make my own mind up. I understand it." So it's not, I have a very broad concern around the polarization of media, but I'm happy to see that a generation that was one of the first ones to really be taught media literacy in some sense is saying back to us, "Look, I get it. I'm not wowed by every, new and improved toothpaste, and I'm not about to join a fanatical cause."
Yes. They ain't buying what you're selling in the traditional way. They need that authentic and personalized attempt. Otherwise, they're not going to waste any time on it.
Okay, I want to talk about the Gen Zs as a representation of the mobility of workforce, because it's something we need to deal with, not just with Gen Zs right now, but with the entire workforce in almost every industry across the country. And if you're in a workforce cohort that's suited to working remotely, and certainly data and content and production and content production all fits in there, the time has changed very rapidly over the last year. The mobility, as I talked about in the opening, is incredibly high. There's a lot of poaching going on. There's plenty of just full on headhunting. I always scan ads to see what the state of workforce is. And I see these incredible ads, are you a Class A programmer, blah, blah, blah. How about 150,000 a year, work remotely? And you laugh and you say, okay, that's not an organization. That's a headhunting company padding its repertoire. But there's a lot of it.
Yeah, there is. And this, you mentioned it in the beginning, maybe a decade ago, we should have been a little bit more attuned to this remote working, but a decade of remote work progress has happened in just a year, over the last year. So Gen Z, this is a huge change in work, a huge change in city life, a huge change in what they view as a traditional workplace. So the one thing I will say on that, though, is that Gen Z, they look at the workplace as a place to get some connection, some personal connection that they normally don't get in their own lives. They're spending 10 hours of non-work screen time a day. So it's all tech. And so they look at work as, this is my time to connect and interact with somebody. And so we recently did a study, and only 6.5% said they want to work primarily remote. 43% said they want a mix of in-person and remote. So that's like the number one choice. But it just being remote, it kind of puts them on an island, a tech island. And that's not really where they want to be, because tech pervades their life like no other.
So are we talking about work becoming more like university was?
Yeah, in a sense. Yeah, and we need to realize the gaps that exist with this generation, and connection is a huge one. The personal connection and work is something like this generation. The 72% want face-to-face communication in the workplace. That's the number one out of any generation. Instead of texting, instead of email, they want to talk face-to-face. And every other generation actually isn't in the same level at all compared to Gen Z as to what they crave for face-to-face connection. And we just need to realize it's a reflex to the non-work time they spend. It's just tech island.
So when you say face-to-face, you are making a distinction between digital face-to-face and physical face-to-face? Question.
Well, digital being the next best thing, of course. I mean, if we have safety protocols, that of course it's not possible. Even just having a Zoom is better than just text and email. So that's, yeah, next best thing to in person, of course, being Zoom.
But the good news is in person is high on their list of values. This is
Huge.
good. And they're not expecting to be in person all the time. I mean, and this speaks to the way our travel industry is evolving in terms of servicing travel. We all expect to go to less meetings. We all will value those meetings. We all will pick very carefully. But the 6 hours on a plane for 18 hours in a market, those kind of things may become less frequent. But just as we want to travel in a transient sense with purpose, we're going to make darn sure we travel in a business sense with purpose. So really their aspirations there line up with the models that we should be evolving anyway.
Yeah, much more mobility, much more global. The world's a lot smaller of a place. Yes.
Yeah, and you can use these other technologies and have valuable interactions and connections. Let's face it. A year ago, everybody thought a Zoom call was, yeah, okay, we can get things done, but it was kind of one of those also rans. And here we've learned how to collaborate better. And I think I told you this story the first time we talked. I know organizations that have international multi offices, and the observation really is, wow, we're working better with our international team offices than we ever were, because that thing that was Zoom that was a novelty isn't anymore.
Yeah, and knowing that you can work from anywhere and still connect, for travel's sake. Yeah, again, this generation will take good advantage of it and find a place, or be a nomad and find different stops along the way and still maintain.
Okay, so we've talked about inclusion and trust. We've talked about stability. Let's talk about authenticity in a context that you brought up. One, destination organizations, employers, travel agencies, hotel chains, in their messaging, there's a requirement to be authentic in order to get past what I call the Gen Z filter number one. If you're inauthentic, I'm not listening. But at the same time, you educated me on this. They hate virtue signaling. So you can be authentic, but don't tell me all the good things you did last week for brownie points.
Yes.
So,
yes. They're going to inspect how your authenticity and transparency is. A simple thing to think about: if you're walking down a street with a Gen X, a Gen Y, and a Gen Z, the Gen X might look at the window of a shop and say, "Oh, that place looks pretty cool. I would probably shop there. I would maybe work there." The Gen Y, the millennial, is going to say, "I want to go in and actually see what it's like, touch some of the product, and talk to the people." The Gen Z is going to say, "I want to go in there and go in the back of the store and see the stock room, see how they're treating their employees and where their product comes from." It's that level of authenticity and transparency that they expect and demand and will judge companies, employers by.
I think we need to evolve the a Gen X, a Gen Y, and a Gen Z walk into a store joke. I love that delivery. That's great. That authenticity you pointed out, again, we were talking earlier, it doesn't just apply to the individual business. It applies to the industry. So there are industries that frankly Gen Zs find inauthentic. And there are industries that they see a high level of authenticity in, and there are industries that they're demanding authenticity from. And one of them is travel. So we've seen a marked shift from the itinerary, jump on this travel, everybody's done, to hit the bucket list, up to Machu Picchu, back down to the surf. And we're seeing a lot more thoughtful travel from this group. Talk to me about authenticity in travel, because I know it's something that inspires you, and not in small part because when you were doing your land development stuff with your family company, you knew that rural land development often was stimulated by tourism development.
Sure, sure. Yeah, it's this travel this travel mindset and how they view destinations and what they're going to be attracted to. That you just have to be in that authentic storytelling part of engaging with this generation. If you're going to talk about your place, or you're going to share about, for me particularly, it would be rural properties. The only way that you can really connect with someone on selling a piece of rural property is there has to be some authentic story points that are true to the property. There might be 4 places, like here's the Twin Pines and here's the glacial stone, and these are all landmarks here true to this property, and you can touch them and feel them and see them. It's with Gen Z, it can't be any bait and switch. The more authentic the footage, the more authentic the people, the more authentic the materials, the more they're going to trust it. And I think it's only going to increase going forward.
I give you a great little allegory on that one. We were opening an inn that had been shuttered for a decade and was magnificently rebuilt by a private company in Southern Ontario. And as part of the regional tourism office, our job was to help them develop content that was sticky. And we brought in pro photographers, and it's a beautiful shot of a bride and a groom standing on an overlook over this gorge by a vanishing pool. It was magnificent. And then there was a shot of an actual wedding, 2 people far off in the distance, standing in a similar spot, nowhere near the production value. And then we A/B tested them, and the authentic one took off, and the other one was wallpaper. And that cohort was exactly in that 20 to 26-year-old range at that time.
A great example, and it rings true, and it's something we all need to keep in mind as this generation just grows in terms of wallet share for all of our businesses.
And we're talking to the tourism industry today. That's our viewership. So in one sense, one of the things I would like to underline just before we close out is this idea that if this industry is perceived as an authentic industry that works hard to cover those other things, inclusion and stability, make life better, not reap profits where other people are suffering, then we stand in better stead with attracting the talent we need from Gen Z. That's a fair statement, isn't it?
Very fair. And if I was going to give you like one indicator that listeners can think about with it is, and it's free, it's cheap to implement this. A lot of times, you might have to spend advertising dollars and whatnot. It's really it's about giving conversation equity. And conversation equity, what I mean is they're going to judge, how inclusive you are based on how much you include them in the conversation. They're going to judge how, authentic you are based on how much of a stake you give them in the conversation. And even from a stability standpoint, how willing you are to connect from an emotional level. And so if you think about how can we build conversation equity, give them a slice of the ownership of this area or this part of our workforce or whatever. It's not about giving shares of a place or free everything or special incentives always. It's giving the equity in the form of conversation that this generation is so used to engaging with their favorite celebrity, even through a DM or a comment on their social media posts. They have that direct interaction and they feel that equity, that they actually matter. So if we think about what can we do here, it's how do we build conversation equity opportunities for this generation to engage with us.
I'm totally moved by your words, and I can't help applying it back to the idea of course, those are their values when you think about, what we were trying to instill in our children when we were,
Right.
when we were bringing this generation forward. I will laugh though. I will say, I heard you on another podcast, and I can't remember the young lady's name. She was a great host. Let me see here.
The
No, I
Bible.
haven't. Yeah, and then talked about words. It was the words, common phrases, and the big one
Oh
was,
yeah,
yeah. What was it? It was thanks, boomer, or something like that.
yeah.
What was the
Okay.
statement?
Yeah, there's this okay boomer eye roll basically to
Yes,
the boomer generation of like you're going to tell us what to do when you and they say that you
just
ruined the
destroyed
world.
the planet,
Yeah, you
ruined
destroyed the
equity.
planet. You brought us to this reckoning that we're all in.
So, and my daughter, the only thing I would say to her in those cases, honestly, Tate, we didn't destroy it. We just didn't fix it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
We
yeah.
certainly
It's
we did make it better, but we didn't fix it. But not better enough for your generation. I'm okay with that.
yeah, and fair or not, these generational wars are real. So building that understanding and empathy is more important than ever.
Yeah, and I mean the values they embrace are values that, if you have a Gen Z, if you could actually do a thing like have a Gen Z, then you know why they have those values, and you likely share them.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Hey, it's great to have you on the show. It's always a really stimulating conversation with you. I look forward to the next time we get to do this. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, David. I was so glad to have this conversation.
Have a great day.
All right, bye.